In your opinion, Doctor, what were some of the main highlights and outcomes of Mr. Tillerson's recent trip to Asia?
Well, we have to remember that it's early in the Trump administration, and Secretary of State Tillerson is not a diplomat by his background. So I think this was a trip to listen and get to know the main actors in East Asia. Many positions in the State Department and the Defense Department remain unfilled. So I think it was to reassure allies and to send the message of U.S. interest in the region, to maintain stability and peace and stability, and no major changes or policy initiatives in my view, though.
Well, in South Korea and Japan, Tillerson sought to reassure the partners of the U.S. commitment to the bilateral security and economic cooperation. So to what extent did he manage to do that?
Well, in South Korea, of course, the president was impeached and removed from office. So here there's a lot of focus on the presidential race and domestic politics. So again, I think people are waiting for who will win that election that will be held in the first week of May. So I think things are kind of in a holding pattern. But that said, the U.S. and South Korea have a bilateral mutual defense treaty that's been in effect since 1954. They have a number of common interests, and regardless of the leadership or who the Secretary of State is, I think those underlying interests remain the same. And I think, again, it was more of a chance to get to know people and get to understand what any changes that possibly could be, which I think would be minor from the U.S. position. And it was a chance for Secretary Tillerson to get to know the people and his interlocutors and counterparts in the region.
You mentioned something interesting. You talked about the 1954 Defense Treaty. This, of course, means the U.S. and South Korea have a long history here. With that said, the North Korean issue came to the forefront, in the last couple of weeks. So what could Rex Tillerson do? I have it here that he actually promised a new approach to the North Korean issue, but what can he do?
I think that the constraints in the region are so great for all of the actors that there's very little wiggle room or opportunity to initiate sweeping policy changes. Everyone, I think, is dissatisfied in the region, whether it's North Korea, South Korea, Beijing or Taipei, or Tokyo or Moscow for that matter, and of course the United States. So everyone is dissatisfied and would like to see a change in the status quo. But if any of these actors were to take a unilateral initiative to change things, in particular to use force, military force, to change anything, it would be so costly that I think the cost would be much greater than any potential benefits. So despite all of the complaints and the rhetoric on all sides, I think mutual deterrence is robust, and that the use of force, despite some of the rhetoric or the way that people parse the words of Secretary Tillerson, I think we come back to this default position of deterrence and sustaining the Korean War armistice, pending some political change, and that could take a very, very long time. It's gone on over 70 years now. And I don't see any major policy initiatives.
Well, essentially what you're saying then, it will be continuous of more of the same. And yet, with that said, in the last couple of weeks, I read on Drudge Report that it seems as if President Trump had sent some bombers to South Korea. It would also appear to be that there were some special forces that were also sent to South Korea. So maybe he will change things in this regard?
Well, there's ongoing military exercises going on in the South, and those are planned well in advance, and those were in the planning stages long before President Trump was inaugurated. And that's not the kind of thing that I think is changed on a whim or changed very easily and very rapidly. So considering the threat from North Korea and what South Korea perceives as an existential threat, they've accelerated their missile development program. They've conducted 5 nuclear tests. The rhetoric out of Pyongyang is the same. If people would read the directives that come out of the Korean Workers' Party and what their objectives are to complete the revolution in the South, to unify Korea on North Korean terms, to change the security architecture in the region, expel the U.S. from the region, and somehow recreate a different kind of security architecture, although they never articulate what that would be. But those are their objectives, and that's not in the interest of South Korea. And South Korea has to do something to defend itself. And its national defense policy has the U.S. alliance is a pillar of that defense policy.
Do you feel that China could push forward with cooperation on North Korea if Mr. Trump backs off on other sensitive bilateral issues, such as the South China Sea or possibly arms sales to Taiwan?
I think that's probably exaggerated. I think when people look at foreign policy, they extrapolate from other experiences or business or something else where they can make some kind of bargain or swap or something like that. But I don't think the issue linkage is there in foreign relations. And I think, countries are going to look at them as a one-off issue. And it would be difficult to deliver separate issues linked to other issues. So I don't think it's very credible. It doesn't work that way. I mean, all the diplomats and people I talk to say it's very, very difficult. You have different people at the working level working on it. When it comes to the time to pull the trigger on those kind of agreements, it just doesn't work out that way. The U.S. has a Taiwan Relations Act. In arms sales, of course, it benefits U.S. arms firm or U.S. armed firms. So I don't see them reversing that. So I think that possibility is greatly exaggerated.
All right. Well, let's change things up for a moment here, and let's talk about North Korea. When many people talk about North Korea, they say that, of course, it's impoverished, it's a nation, a disaster, it's a humanitarian disaster. People have to eat grass. It's a very poor place, and essentially it's hell on earth. And yet, with that said, it's also true that North Korea arguably has one of the better militaries of the world, albeit very small. They do operate at a very high level if they're testing nuclear weapons or testing the rocketry to be able to fire those weapons off. They have a large standing army. So what do you feel about North Korea? Is it an impoverished nation, or does it really have the ability to launch a military or to sustain a military action against the other countries of the world?
North Korea allocates a tremendous amount of their national resources towards the military. That said, they have a lot of antiquated equipment. They don't have the kind of resources to sustain a long-term conventional military campaign. They've had to make decisions about how to allocate resources and kind of enact kind of triage system. So they have so many people under arms, they can't train all of them adequately, so they selectively train groups. They're light infantry forces, they're special operations forces, and they allocate a lot of resources to asymmetric capabilities such as cyber warfare, nuclear weapons, artillery, submarines, tunnels, and other kinds of tactics where they think that they could apply those asymmetric capabilities and gain an advantage. In some areas, they're very backwards, such as modern fighter aircraft, tanks are antiquated, and so forth. So they would want to fight any kind of military conflict on their terms or in ways that it would give them an advantage. Any military does that, and every military does that. So they would use things like cyber warfare, electronic warfare, possibly WMD, missile strikes, and those kinds of things. But as far as sustaining a long-term conventional warfare or conventional war, I don't think they can do that. I think they know that. So any theory of victory for the North would have to be a conflict that would be completed very quickly before South Korean allies could bring resources into the region and bring that force to bear upon the North.
Well, taking into consideration everything that you said, though, they have had decades to be able to prepare the battlefield in their favor. It's been said that they have their own fiber network, so they're not necessarily connected to the internet. I remember reading not too long ago that one of the past CIA directors had said that North Korea was impenetrable. They didn't have assets inside the country. They were unable to go after it electronically. And maybe that's just what he said, but that was the quote. Because of the borders, the aircraft, even if it's antiquated, would still be a threat simply because of the amount of literal airspace that's there. They're very close. So with that said, what would it take for the U.S. and South Korea to engage in military action against North Korea? Is this always off the table here? Will there always just be mean and angry letters sent to the UN? Or finally, will the U.S. and South Korea just say, hey, enough is enough?
Well, the military is always on the table, or part of a calculation for any state as it seeks to achieve its political objectives. So it's always been on the table. The U.S. fought a war here in the early 50s, and a number of other allies that came to support Republic of Korea. Of course, the Chinese People's Volunteers supported the North. The war ended in an armistice, so the two sides signed a military agreement, a ceasefire, which is still in effect. So from the U.S. perspective, and I don't think this changes regardless of the change in personnel or presidents or what have you, the U.S. has a long-standing mutual defense treaty with South Korea, and the commander, the United Nations command commander, who's the U.S. general here, has an obligation to fulfill the armistice and to maintain the ceasefire. So those are the first two objectives, and of course the follow-on objectives of maintaining peace and stability and security in East Asia. I think everyone wants to avoid a war. It would be catastrophic for everyone. So that's the first order of business for the U.S. And so the military piece of it, I think, is only for deterrence, really, despite the dissatisfaction and the opposition to North Korea's objectives or acquisition of nuclear weapons. So I look at it as basically having three options. So one would be that the U.S., South Korea, its allies, and the rest of the world, the UN Security Council, everyone else, just surrender and appease North Korea, just give them everything they want. Let them unify the Korean Peninsula on their terms. The U.S. leaves the region, terminates their security alliances and everything else. That's one option. The second option is a preventive war, disarm North Korea by force, something like we saw in Iraq. But that would be so costly that any gains that could be obtained wouldn't be worth the cost. So, of course, deterrence can fail. There could be miscalculation or errors or accidents that escalate. And then, of course, force could be brought into the equation. And then the other option is, deterrence, which I just said, and then preventive war or appeasement and surrender. So I don't see how someone's going to launch a preventive war, or the U.S. and its allies going to launch a preventive war unilaterally, given the current conditions. Something can change. There could be an accident, or North Korea could lash out. But without that happening, how is the U.S. and its allies going to launch a preventive war? No one's going to support that. South Korea's not going to support it. Japan's not going to support it. Japan provides logistics bases that would be used to flow materials to the peninsula. The UN Security Council is not going to support it. And then, by the way, China has a treaty of friendship with North Korea that includes a security clause. So if the United States were to launch an unprovoked military attack against North Korea, I just don't see how they're going to make that work and how you're going to implement such policy.
Although North Korea has carried out numerous missile tests and claims to have developed nuclear weapons, it is unknown how powerfully armed the country is. So do you believe that the North Korea poses a real safety threat to Japan or South Korea or even to the U.S.?
North Korea having a nuclear arsenal and having the ability to deliver nuclear weapons to targets in the region and at long ranges to the U.S., that changes the calculation, and it changes the way that South Korea and its allies can operate militarily in the region. However, if North Korea were to ever use a nuclear weapon against any targets or to use it in anger in a military conflict, I'm convinced that the U.S. extended deterrence is robust, and the U.S. counterstrike capability is very robust. And if North Korea were to do that, it would be committing suicide.